Hello, my name is Tusha Vince. I am Vice Chair of START, and this pre-recorded presentation is to guide new assessors for the START assessment. Over the course of the next 30 minutes, 45 minutes or so, we will be talking about why do we do START as a college. And I really want you to take home from this that this is not an exam, and therefore, for example, if you are an examiner for RCPCH, this is not marked in the same way. And the ethos here of the START assessment is that it is for formative feedback for the next generation of consultants. Are we alone in doing this? Well, pretty much, because actually, if you look at all the other Royal Colleges, they tend to have exit exams. So, just as we've got membership to enter into registrar or higher specialist training, these services have an entrance exam to consultanthood, which doesn't really make much sense to me personally. Because we all recognize that the step up to consultancy is huge. There is no denying this. But actually what there is a growing recognition of the non-technical skills, the things that we do differently as consultants than we did as registrars, because actually life is not just about clinical knowledge or clinical skills. It's about much more than that. And the GMC have recognized this. You may be aware that we are using Progress Plus or moving towards it. And that is because the pediatrics was the first new curriculum to be signed off by the GMC to have a focus on what we describe as general professional capabilities. So yes, you are supposed to have a clinical knowledge and have skills, but they're looking more at professional values and behaviours. So research, safeguarding, being collegiate and looking after your teams. And this idea of moving to general professional capabilities is something that's been introduced across medicine in general. So lots of colleges are rewriting their curriculum. We're ahead of the game. This has come about because of patient safety inquiries primarily. So how do we apply that in START? Well, there are 10 scenarios, 7 of which are generic, that are sat by all the trainees. Critical appraisal, which is reviewing a paper to see if it works, a bit like a journal club. Safe prescribing is critiquing somebody else's prescription. Teaching a small group, how do they deal with conflict, ethics, and safeguarding. Now, handover is slightly different because if you're a neonatal trainee, you will get a neonatal handover to critique and prioritize. Everybody else will do a general pediatric one. And then depending on your subspecialty, whether it's general pediatrics, rheumatology, etc., you have 3 more scenarios. And although they are specialty context, they are still looking at these general professional capabilities. Generally speaking, what happens after START? Well, the trainees will get feedback and they will say, well, you're currently working at a senior trainee level, or you're working at a day 1 consultant level or a 6-month consultant level. And those relate to needs further development, meeting expectations and exceeding expectations respectively. Our feedback describes what we were looking for in where you need to be, where you are now as described, and gives how to get their tips through pragmatic, practical steps, which is actually so that the trainee can create their post-START PDP. And all of this feeds into the ARCP. So if any of you sit on ARCP panels, you'll know that people don't really look at the feedback from START, but what they really are interested in is the post-START PDP, because the result in itself, as ever, doesn't really matter. It's what you do with the result that matters. And as we're moving to a senior trainee becoming consultant, it's actually managing the gap in their skill base that is important for us to know. So START is definitely not an exit exam. In all the years that this has been run, I'm not aware of a single trainee who had their CCT deferred or denied because of the START assessment. What we do find, though, is that particularly with trainees who don't have insight into their gaps, START provides an independent view of what the local training team already know. And therefore, it's really helpful for them in trying to guide a trainee to say, it's not just us, you've had 10 independent assessors with 10 assessments that say, these are the themes that we really need to work on. So currently, START is a multi-scenario, a must-sit, but crucially, it's a formative assessment because it is based entirely around feedback of the level 3 competencies for trainees. Maybe one day we can include those folk who are, rather than CCTing, will become Caesars, but that's a conversation for another day. So what does START look like for you as an assessor? Well, you might be interested to know where the scenarios come from. This normally happens at boards, and a group of people will willingly sit down and write a scenario based on their own subspecialty. So they will create the trainee information, which is basically the instructions or the vignette to the scenario, and the associated assessor information, which replicates the vignette, but also provides the guidance for how you score these scenarios. Then these scenarios are scrutinized by the START board, who review and refine the criteria so that they are clear and easy to follow and are discriminating. There's not too much overlap between the different scores. And it matches and is aligned to the ethos of START, which is focusing on non-technical skills. And then we provide benchmarking, which are the assessment criteria, the feedback template that you will become familiar with when you assess. How do we help you as assessors in crafting your skill? Well, hopefully you will be able to come to a training day or a training session, much like this one. And on the actual assessment days, at the beginning, you can observe and then actually start assessing yourself. And once you start assessing, a supporting assessor who is experienced in START will observe silently online and will comment on how you have run the scenario and managed the professional conversation and also the quality of your feedback. This will be given back to you as written feedback, and you can obviously use that in terms of your portfolio for your appraisal, if you like, for your skills as an educational supervisor. We would love to be able to assess all assessors once per diet, but at the moment we're focusing on new assessors so that we can guide their feedback. So before the assessment, you will be sent your scenario and the feedback template. You'll also be given contact details of any co-assessors. You may be aware that we run more than one circuit simultaneously, so there will be somebody else normally who is looking at the same scenario as you. And so therefore, if you need to, you can have a conversation with them just to make sure that you're going to be marking and scoring along the same lines. However, as START has evolved and the provision of the benchmarking criteria has progressed and the feedback templates, people are finding that they don't need to have the conversation because the guidance is clear enough. So therefore, you'll receive the trainee information and the assessor information, the benchmarking criteria, which is like your assessor guide, and the feedback template. What you need to do before the assessment is to really consider what's important. How are you going to be able to tell the difference between someone who is functioning at a senior trainee level, a day one consultant, and a 6-month consultant? You should also consider if you want to add anything to the feedback template in terms of resources. The question is not, is this person ready to be a consultant? The question actually that needs to be answered in START is, what does this trainee need to do to be ready? Because clearly they are going to be at least a year, if not 18 months before their CCT date. So obviously there will be things that they can work towards and improve on. Normally this is because of a lack of exposure to the kind of things we do as consultants. So on the day of the assessment itself, we will have a briefing that will tell you, for example, if someone is not appearing because they're unwell. We'll go through the marking platform, which is called Osler, and Slack, which is a almost like an instant messaging service, slightly separate, where you will be able to communicate with RCPCH staff if there's an issue, or one of the supporting assessors. Then you undertake the assessment, which is a series of supervised learning events like a CBD discussion, or a conversation between yourself and a newly appointed consultant colleague to say, what are you going to do about this? How can we manage this, that, and the other? So it might be clinically based. It might be more likely it's going to be logistically based. You will then write your feedback. And at the end of the assessment, we run an assessor debrief. Now that's because what we're trying to do is to really provide the right support for trainees. So, for example, at the moment, if a trainee gets a significant concern, which is the step below needing further development, we will write to the trainee and to their educational supervisor and say, you got a significant concern, you need to talk about this. And I'll go on about significant concern scoring a bit later on. However, as an educational supervisor, if I had a trainee who's had, let's say, 5 needing further developments out of the 10, I would want to know about that, but that wouldn't be flagged to us as the START board unless we had the debrief. So that's why we run the debrief sessions. So if you're unaware of this, that generally speaking, trainees will get 4 minutes of reading time. And we do need that time because the scenarios and their vignettes are actually quite wordy. And so I'm particularly keen for those trainees with dyslexia, etc., that they get adequate, reasonable adjustments and can read this. Now, clearly, if they've got something much bigger to read, such as safe prescribing or the critical appraisal, that will be sent separately and they'll be given more time to undertake that. The trainee is with you for 8 minutes and there's a warning, about a minute before the end. And that's a good time to start wrapping up or making sure that you've covered all the points that you are required to by the scenario. And then the trainee moves on to read the next scenario. What I do in terms of scoring is, whilst the scenario is ongoing, I am writing a commentary. I am completing the feedback template. You were able to describe X aspect. I would like to have seen more of Y. I would like to see more of Y aspect in your discussion. And then in the 4 minutes between trainees, you'll be able to go back and forth, but you should be scoring them then. And there are only about 6 or 7 scores that you need to input. And these are the 6 or 7. So every scenario will have a section on decision-making, knowledge base, management of complexity, professional approach, safety and risk management, and comm skills. And then after all of that, you have to give the global rating. Now, giving the global rating is not a simple matter of just adding up the domains, because there might be something so peculiar in one of the domains, even though everything else is flawless, that it might really affect your global score. So, for example, you could have a flawless discussion about something, but then actually what you find is what you want to do is, because of a particular dogmatic or inflexible approach on one thing, let's say, no, absolutely, I will not refer this person to the coroner, then it might take you from being someone who's working at exceeding expectations down to this bit needs further development. So this requires your judgment, really, more than anything else. So what happens after that? In terms of the portfolio, we will document in the portfolio how the trainee has performed in each of these areas. You can see here expected, expected, expected. Okay, and then right at the bottom, it's not written feedback. That is where you will put copy and pasted the feedback template. And if you require a more visual impression to help you look at these things, then college provides this form as well. So I mentioned significant concerns. What are these? This is where you get something that is so kind of out with expectations that perhaps the trainee is a bit dangerous or unaware of their limitations or can't answer the scenario at all. And that is something that we've used to find quite a lot when we had clinical based scenarios that were too clinical. Yeah. If they don't take responsibility and delegate too much, or then, you know, not delegating appropriately, or they lack integrity. These happen about once every diet. So one trainee will get a significant concern, and it's quite high stakes because obviously people don't like being told that there's a significant concern about their performance. But what we're actually saying is, if we just left the trainee to their own devices, we don't think that they would be able to sort this out without the involvement of the ES before they reach CCT. So in order to give this to a trainee, we ask that you as assessors discuss it with your supporting assessor. So for example, in the teaching scenario, if the trainee has taught something that is completely not pitched at the level of the trainee in front of them, and it just shows, you know, everything they know about, for example, surfactant protein deficiency, that's not necessarily a significant concern. It might have been an absolutely abysmal performance, but actually that person just needs to really focus on how to teach, and they may not have been used to or had enough exposure to teaching in a small group format. So that's why we can sometimes, as supporting assessors, help you account for why and describe why there are significant concerns. And this then gets related to the feedback. So this is the format of what the feedback will look like. At the beginning, it will be, this is what the scenario was looking for, where you need to be. And then there's a bit in the middle that you have to fill in because it's trainee specific. That's the bit here in purple, italicized and underlined. And then at the bottom is, for future practice you may benefit from. So these are the tangible, practical steps that you need to give. But you can understand, and I'm going to labour this point because feedback is the core of our activity here. If you don't write any feedback, the trainee doesn't know what they did or they didn't do. So here again, the where you need to be is the benchmarking criteria. It's the bit at the top of the feedback template. How to get there are the practical tips. Now, writing something banal, nebulous, and nondescript like good, practice more doesn't actually help people who have got a year to 18 months left. So how do we give good feedback fast? Well, we're saying that feedback should be a positive learning experience. Actually, I have to say, everybody leaves START with a great big smile on their face. But for your homework, what I'd like you to do is go and watch either an episode of MasterChef or an episode of the Great British Bake Off, and look in particular at how they give feedback. So for example, in the Great British Bake Off, in the technical challenge, they'll actually talk about what they're looking for, i.e. where you need to be. And then they judge, and then they give the feedback to each contestant like, oh, you were number 12 because it didn't quite rise, you put too much fruit in it and therefore it was too heavy, and that's why it didn't look very good. Okay, so they're telling people what they were looking for, how they've lined up against it, and what they could do differently. Don't put so much fruit in it. Okay? And it's the same with MasterChef. And this is the format of feedback that will really help our trainees move forward, because all they want to do is improve. So here's an option, because people are saying, well, you know, 4 minutes is really difficult. It's a very short space of time. And it is a short space of time. And that's why we need to be quite strategic about our feedback. And those of you who are examiners will have been drilled in how to write feedback the way that the exams team want. I personally quite like the right-hand side, the 5 fab words. I liked what you did X, Y, and Z because. So this tells the trainee what was good, why it's important. I would have liked to see more of A, B, and C. Next time, consider, try, or suggest. And that way it's constructive feedback. I tend to write feedback to the trainee. You were able, you were able. Another way, and you'll see it quite a lot in the feedback, is the 4 N's, the nuggets. I liked the way you did this. In future, continue it because. I didn't like, I've changed that to I would have liked to see more of, etc., etc. Ultimately, the trainee should feel supported by us. They should feel that they can do something to make this better. If we start with something positive, actually, there's a lot of evidence to say that the recipient of the feedback will absorb more of it. So rather than it feeling like a criticism, it's a critique, and we have noticed the good things that they have done. So again, this is the example of feedback. But imagine if you didn't write anything, it would look really disconnected. So I'm going to give you some real examples, because did you know that after every START assessment, it takes about 80 man-hours for college staff to craft the feedback when people don't write it properly? And I'm not talking about commas and punctuation and spelling errors. I'm talking about, what do we actually write to trainees if we as assessors are not doing our job properly? So here we go. If you write well done and good job, how do you as an educational supervisor get a visual image of how your trainee performed in the scenario? I would suggest that you don't. So let's look at this in the critical appraisal. And this trainee got an exceeding expectations. In this station, I liked the way you analysed the article. I would also have liked you to include one further research possibility. Really? One? Why? Makes no sense to me. So this is an example of suboptimal feedback. But here's another one in conflict. They're only meeting. So when the trainee says to you, what else did I need to do to get an exceeding? All you have as an ed soup is, I liked your approach to offer solutions. It's not helpful. It's not detailed enough. And trainees are really helpful in saying, okay, I understand the first bit, get that. And I really like the feedback I get that's about me, what I did, what they would like to see more of. And yeah, the feedback resources at the end, the practical steps seem a bit generic, but that's okay. That's not too bad. So here's another one, for example. This is a general scenario about cough and wheeze, and the global score was needs further development. So do we get that from the feedback? If you read this, you did recognize the child might not have asthma, but then you only considered immune disorders. I'd have liked you to think about other chronic conditions. Remember to think outside your area of expertise. I was also expecting a more specific family history to consider whether, is this child the only one not thriving, or is this normal for the family? You ended up missing many of the aspects above, and I was unable to get you to change tack with prompting. So I think that from this feedback, I get a good visual image of what went on, but also I understand why the needs further development was given. So here's an example that you can use in your training with your facilitator today. This is in the safe prescribing. Reading this feedback, it'll be really good for you to work out or predict what you think the global score would be. And I'll leave this so that your facilitator can come back to it if you need to. Here's another example that your facilitator can work with you. And you can pause this presentation at any time. And finally, a general one on this. And finally, let's say you're an educational supervisor and you have a trainee who has undertaken START and you need to help them create their PDP, or you want to critique their PDP. What do you do? This is my advised approach. If there are any scenarios with significant concerns, you have to address it. And you have to get the trainee to specifically address the deficit and link it to the general professional capabilities. Then I would look at any area or any scenario that has got a global score or even individual domain scores that need further development. Are there scenarios, are there themes that you need to pick up on? So for example, if there's quite a few themes, I would have liked you to talk about this with other people. You're taking too much on yourself. That's the principle that needs to be addressed in the PDP. And obviously, I would prioritize those scenarios that have more than one NFD, whether it's across the domains and the global score. And all the other scenarios then, again, I would look for themes. Now, some people, trainees will say, oh, I was just really, really nervous. But we're all going to come across situations that make us scared in clinical practice. And so the marker of a resilient or good consultant is one who can work despite their nerves. So I would have a high threshold for trainees saying, oh, I just performed badly because of nerves, because we need to work out how we can get you to perform well despite nerves. And if you think about it, there are about 2 or 3 points of feedback for each of the scenarios. So each trainee is going to get something like 30 bits of feedback. Don't do them all, just pick out the ones that are really useful to this trainee's development. So I'd go for 2 to 3. And if you're picking out themes, you go for the themes first. Our suggestions aren't absolute by any means, and they're certainly not mandatory, but addressing them is mandatory. And so what we're trying to do is just provide suggestions so that the trainees can improve and move forward. Hope you've enjoyed that presentation. Now I'm going to hand back to your facilitator so you can perhaps go over those feedback topics again.